The head of the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis is calling for peace, reconciliation, and a greater respect for human life after the verdict was read. Archbishop Bernard Hebda writes in part, "The verdict is a sobering moment for our community." The Archbishop continues, asking Jesus, quote, to bring healing into our communities, comfort to the family of George Floyd and all who mourn, and satisfaction to those who thirst for justice. Joining us now is Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers, co-host of EWTN's God's Blueprint for a Happy Life. Deacon Harold, welcome back. Always so great to see you. First off, I'd like to get your thoughts on the guilty verdict. How do you think people of faith should respond?
Well, the first thing we need to do always is to pray for the families. Pray for the families of George Floyd and of Mr. Chauvin as well. This has been an extremely difficult, heartbreaking situation that never should have happened in the first place. The jury looked at all the evidence. They weighed it in light of the presentation by the prosecution and the defense. And using the rule of law, they rendered their decision, and that's something we have to stand by. I totally agree with the bishops of Minnesota that we should use this decision as a way of remembering that we have to look at the dignity of the human person in every single human being made in the image and likeness of God, that we're all children of God. We need to recognize that in each other.
Well, there have been calls for police reform, as you know, and I also know that you spent more than 20 years in law enforcement. From your perspective, what, if anything, do you think needs to be done?
Well, I will be the first one to say that there definitely needs to be reform. And here's what I mean by that. For 6 years in my career, I had the great honor and privilege of serving on the board of the Department of Public Safety Standards and Training for the state of Oregon. That's the agency that provides training and resources for public safety officers throughout the entire state. And so I'm intimately familiar with how police officers are trained. So what happens is this: the training they receive is excellent. What they don't identify within that training are biases. So, for example, they use the typical psychological screening tool is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. What that inventory doesn't look for is bias. So you have an officer that comes in with a preconceived prejudice or bias in his head. I don't like Black people or Hispanic people or white people or Asian people. You give this officer a skill set, the tools that he needs to keep himself and those that he's sworn to protect safe. But now this officer is exercising that duty with these preconceived biases in his head. See, and what that looks like is systemic racism, but it's actually not. We got to be careful throwing around that term systemic racism. So what you would have to say is that police agencies, by their very nature, the way they operate in their processes, procedures, and methods, either written or unwritten, as an entire body, are saying, I believe that my race is superior to this other person's race, therefore I will treat them differently. That's very different than an individual within the system who has prejudice or bias and is exercising that in their functions and duties.
Before I let you go, Deacon, I do want to ask you this. I mean, it's been a really tough time over the past year or so, but how can we move forward? How can we all, come together and start to heal as a nation?
Yes, I think it goes back to the scriptures. I think it goes back to the Good Samaritan. The Samaritan was the Jewish person was at the side of the road. He was passed by people that looked like him. But it was the Samaritan, the stranger, the one that was supposed to be hated. He was the one who had pity and mercy on the person and treated them with dignity and respect. And it's easy to look back in retrospect and say, I would do the same thing. But what if that person laying on the side of the road was Officer Chauvin? What if that person on the side of the road was a person who molested you or raped you or drove drunk and killed your spouse? The anger and the hatred we feel would burn like a fire. But we have to remember the words of Jesus. We must forgive. The Samaritan calls us to a new standard of holiness, where we exclude no one on the grounds of race or prejudice. And so we must be the Samaritan.
Absolutely. We must forgive. Thank you so much, Deacon Harold. We really appreciate you coming on and speaking with us today. Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers, co-host of EWTN's God's Blueprint for a Happy Life. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.